So as we debate this difficult issue of how to handle the pandemic, let me share with you an expert opinion from the US on living with the coronavirus. And surprise, surprise, it's not all black and white. There are swings and roundabouts to debate, but importantly, it starts with the realisation we might never see a vaccine. And we have to discuss the possibility of most of us being infected eventually, or at least the nearly two-thirds of us required to deliver herd immunity. Here's Associate Professor Perry Wilson from the Yale School of Medicine.
But if 65% of us are going to get it eventually, then you can make a particularly utilitarian and somewhat strange argument about our public health measures. Maybe we should flatten the curve just enough to avoid overwhelming our hospitals, but no more. Get through this as quickly as possible without leading to excess deaths. It even gives a quantifiable metric to score the government's response. As long as a single person doesn't get denied care because of hospital overcrowding, it's a victory. There's a lot appealing about this argument, but I want to deconstruct it a bit from a practical, epidemiological, and ethical perspective. First, the practical. Delaying the spread of the disease doesn't only help hospitals cope with surges, it also buys us time to do medical research, identify treatments, and find vaccines.
Yes, indeed, time is important because it's so valuable. Treatments have already improved out of sight if doctors have learned more about this virus. Your prospects are actually much better now than if you were infected with coronavirus in March, for instance. Then, as we're seeing in Victoria, there's the problem of controlling the spread of infection.
Another practical issue is that there's really no way to just skirt under overwhelming our hospitals. We can't just dial up and dial down the disease spread. It's different in different places and substantially lags policy choices. There's also a stochastic element here. Outbreaks will happen and they will not be predictable.
Yep, controlling the rate of infection is diabolically difficult. And there's the crushing moral questions too. Even if rationally you know the virus will spread across the population eventually, the speed at which that happens makes a great deal of difference to those who inevitably are going to lose their lives.
Finally, the ethical. Even if we assume the total death rate is the same, which I hope at this point I've convinced you is not the case, compressing those deaths into a shorter period of time still robs people of life. I mean, look, 100% of people die eventually. As physicians, the war against death is one we will always lose, but we fight the battle to push that day as far into the future as possible. I think we need to keep that in mind as we continue to struggle with COVID-19. Every day is a victory.
Yes, indeed. Every day you wake up in this vale of tears is a victory. But when it comes to battling the coronavirus, the cost-benefit analysis of how we best manage this has really only just begun. I thought we'd tackle that debate today by bringing in the foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Thanks for joining me, Greg. The reason your perspective is fascinating is that you're experiencing this living in Melbourne. You've been highly critical of the Daniel Andrews government's implementation of what they've been doing, but you do support the approach. You do think that the hard lockdown is the best way to go. Explain why.
So I do, Chris, and thanks so much for having me on your program. I think you've set a very high example of the rational way to discuss the pros and cons of this. And I think too much of these arguments pass each other by in Australia and never engage with each other. So I don't know that we had to go absolutely as far as Andrews has gone in lockdown, but I think many things that Perry Wilson said then were very interesting. So he confirms what Nick Coatsworth, Greg Hunt, Professor Raina McIntyre have told me, and every professional, serious person I've ever spoken to about it. Herd immunity is about 60 or 65%. Yet a great body of the people who are saying, you know, we're overreacting, this is not much worse than a bad dose of the flu and so on, are saying herd immunity is at 20%. So let's be very careful about getting the facts right. Secondly, he also says that you're best to delay the thing as long as possible because treatments might get better. Thirdly, while he says it's possible we won't get a vaccine, most of the scientists are pretty optimistic we will get a vaccine. Now, if you get a vaccine that is 80% effective and you apply it to 80% of the population, that'll be 64% of people who are immune. That gives you your herd immunity at least for a year. So you do everything you can to, to get to that day with a minimum number of deaths. And then finally, people who say we're overreacting, well, what is the alternative? Instead of 500, 700 a day, would it be better to have 7,000 infections a day? You're not only then condemning a lot of people in aged care homes to dying, because, as Paul Kelly said today, in every country in the world where you've got community transmission, it's got into aged care homes in a big way. But you're also condemning a lot of health workers to die. In Britain and the United States, hundreds of doctors, nurses and healthcare workers have died from COVID. That doesn't happen in a flu season, and it would only get worse rather than get better.
Yeah, now we have a flu vaccine and we change that every year, and there's billions of dollars spent around the world trying to suppress the flu each year. And so what you say, the whole game changes if there is an effective vaccine. And as you say, the effectiveness of a vaccine and the availability, we just don't know that. We don't know the timing of that. So it becomes a matter of questions of timing, doesn't it? For instance, if you take the extreme example of New Zealand, they are in a very enviable position at the moment. They've made themselves virtually COVID-free. But at some stage, if they're going to open up to the world and restart their tourism industry and therefore get their economy going again, they are going to have to deal with the virus. How long can they delay that? A year, 2 years, 5 years?
Well, of course, if we get a vaccine within that 5 years, then they look like the world's greatest geniuses, because they've got, virtually no deaths and they've got a cure. But Chris, I don't think it's just a question of timing. You see, I don't think any policymaker in the world could look his people in the eye and say, well, OK, it's been 2 years now, we haven't got a vaccine, we're just going to have to grin and bear it. Thousands and thousands of you are going to die. Hundreds of health workers are going to die. We've just got to grin and bear it because of for the sake of the economy. I don't think it's ever going to be that black and white. It may be that international travel is forever changed. It may be that you can only come to Australia if you quarantine for 2 weeks or if you have a vaccination certificate, assuming we get a vaccine. But no Australian government, I mean, this is so far, this discussion in a sense, not your discussion, Chris, but the theoretical discussion is so far from what policymakers are thinking about. No one in the Morrison government has ever thought that they're going to consciously allow, herd immunity as a policy, that they're going to open up travel in a way which brings the disease in large numbers.
No, but no one in the Morrison government ever suggested that they would lock down interstate travel the way the states have done. And indeed, the whole basis of our approach has changed before our very eyes. I would have thought the sort of approach that people like me talk about and focus on, it's far from this argument, this sort of this dichotomy between a full lockdown and let it rip. It's all about a balance somewhere in the middle. And early on, the Chief Medical Officer, the Prime Minister, even the Premiers, were talking about flattening the curve, ensuring that this thing never got away from us in a way that our health system was overwhelmed. We increased our critical care beds from 2,500 to 7,500, yet we've gone into full lockdown when only a small fraction of that capacity has ever been required.
So, Chris, you make the argument really well, as I'd expect, but let me try to unpack that a bit. I don't think our approach has changed at all. We were flattening the curve in part to get time to increase the capacity of our health system. But already in Victoria, just with some hundreds of cases per day, we are having to import nurses from interstate. Your healthcare system can get overwhelmed in all kinds of different ways. It was overwhelmed in northern Italy. It was effectively overwhelmed in New York. A lot of people died because they were tipped out of hospitals and sent back to aged care facilities in both New York and the United Kingdom. The health system was effectively overwhelmed. It's not just how many people have you got in ICU beds. It's also clear if you have 7,500 people in ICU beds, you're asking a lot of health workers to die as a result of this policy.
Well,
but not only that, Chris,
you never want to get near that situation, and especially given how long people spend there. And you made some very important points about the numbers too. We saw how diabolical the situation was in New York, yet they're nowhere near herd immunity with those numbers. But the question is whether or not eventually you may have to confront this virus anyway. And the more damage you do to your society and economy before you confront it, is only going to increase the pain when you do.
Well, let me make a couple of quick points on that. First of all, if the virus gets out of control, it kills your economy anyway. No one will send their kids to school. Indeed, less heroic health workers will stop turning up for shifts. Aged care homes will be abandoned. The whole society breaks down anyway. Professor Raina McIntyre, who has spent her lifetime studying this, says if you get 5% infection rate, the society breaks down anyway. Just forget about your economy. Secondly, we are confronting the virus. I think New South Wales is doing a great job. What level can we put up with?
That's the question.
We can put up with the level New South Wales has got. And of course, you can't say what level can we put up with in terms of a number of infections, but it's the trend of infections.
Yep.
Because the virus has the capability always to increase exponentially, you have to see 20 infections a day is okay, as long as you're not getting an exponential increase. What we got in Victoria through the Andrews government's incompetence was an exponential increase. The final quick point I'd make to you, Chris, I actually think the state-based borders are very sensible because they are very convenient administrative units. What you've seen in Britain after their terrible deaths, 45,000 deaths, you've seen individual cities locked down. Leicester has had to lock down. Preston has had to lock down. It's actually quite hard to do that in Australia because our capital cities are so sprawling. You try to lock down some suburbs, it doesn't really work. So if you've got no infections in Queensland, you don't want to import them from Victoria. I say as a Victorian, that makes perfect sense to me. And the final point is, another element of eventually confronting it is we're all going to have to learn to take the advice of the health authorities very seriously. If they say wear a mask, we can't say, well, wearing a mask is stupid. The chief medical officer tells me to wear a mask, but I read it, in the North Carolina Ballistic Review that masks are ineffective, therefore I won't wear one. I love our larrikin Celtic defiant spirit, but it's not the best in a pandemic situation.
Greg, you say you're a Victorian now, but I know you're a Canterbury Bankstown boy still at heart. It's a fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us. Let's continue it again another time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Real pleasure.
Greg Sheridan there, an articulate advocate on these issues, isn't he? I thought it'd be great to have that discussion, and we will come back and thrash it out with him later on.